everyone, and thank you for joining me in today's study of Genesis chapter 18. I had read in a book by the late Dr. Billy Graham, and one of his stories in there is about a neurologist in Philadelphia. He had just gone to bed after a long day, and he woke up to someone knocking at his door. When he went to the door and opened it, there was a little girl standing outside in the snow. And he could tell by the way that she was dressed that she was obviously very poor. She had to be freezing in this winter storm. But instead of asking to come inside and to get warm, she immediately told him that her mother was sick and that she needed help. Now, doesn't it always seem that interruptions in our lives always come at the most inconvenient times? Although he was bone tired, he got dressed and followed this little girl in the storm to the poor side of town, and she led him to this tiny house. When he went inside, he found the woman laying inside there with pneumonia. So he quickly called for medical help and sat down beside the woman to stay there until help arrived. While he sat there, he told her that she was very blessed to have such a smart and persistent little daughter. And she gave him this strange look. And then she informed him that her daughter had died about a month ago, and that all her stuff was over there in the corner of the room. The doctor looked, and there was the same coat that the girl that knocked on his door was wearing, only it was warm and dry. And Billy Graham went on to say, I wonder if this was the work of God's angels. And when I hear stories like that, I wonder too. Now today, people get skeptical when they hear of things like this. And surprisingly, even Christians get skeptical, even though the Bible is full of factual events that took place in a similar manner. Obviously, it wasn't the raven's idea to feed Elijah. That had to be supernatural. We have no problem with the angel Gabriel appearing to Mary and Joseph when we read of the Christmas story. And we forget that others experienced angelic visitors, such as the women who were at the tomb of Jesus, Gideon, David, Zechariah, Cornelius, and Peter, and a whole host of others. And in today's study, we're going to see a visit from heavenly beings at the door of Abraham's tent. And although this story is about far more than just angels paying a visit, that definitely grabs your attention immediately at the beginning of this chapter. But we're also going to see the amazing hospitality of Abraham and Sarah. And we're going to see the Lord being faithful to his promises. And we're going to see the judgment that's approaching a wicked city. And also we're going to hear the heart of Abraham as he prays for intercession on behalf of that city. So in chapter 18, let us begin with the first 5 verses. Now the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre, while he was sitting at the tent door in the heat of the day. When he lifted up his eyes and looked, behold, 3 men were standing opposite him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them, and bowed himself to the earth. And he said, My Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, please do not pass your servant by. Please let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will bring a piece of bread that you may refresh yourselves. After that you may go on, since you have visited your servant. And they said, So do as you have said. This amazing visit took place at Mamre, where he first entered Canaan. When he first got to this place, Abram built an altar there. And after his mistake in Egypt, he returned to Mamre and had been living there ever since, still in a tent. This place would become home for Abraham. He didn't live to see the land of Canaan become the nation of Israel. Abraham's only property that he actually ever owned was a cave in Machpelah near Mamre right here, where he would bury Sarah. Of course, after she dies, not right now. Abraham himself would be buried in this cave, along with his son Isaac. This place is repeatedly called the Oaks of Mamre, but more than likely it was terebinth trees instead of oak trees. But from what commentaries say, it's kind of like an oasis. It's a beautiful place in the midst of this dry land. So wherever you see live trees, especially trees like the willow trees where I live, you can be sure that there is water underground. And water is necessary for the survival of Abraham's entourage and all of the animals he's responsible for. So in verse 1, we find Abraham at the door of the tent. taking what you would call a siesta at high noon. Many places that's in dry climates, they shut down during the hottest parts of the day. I'm not sure about Mamre exactly where Abraham was, but he came from Ur, which is modern day Iraq. And sometimes in the summer, the temperatures can reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit or 51 degrees Celsius. It can get really hot. Humans and animals would be in danger of heat stroke and exhaustion, much less the high temperature of the sand would make it like walking on a skillet. So during the peak of the day, it was wise to find shade and relax and just let the sun do its thing and then come back out when it's much cooler. Here we find Abraham sitting by the door. Now, maybe it's cooler by the door where there might be a chance of a breeze, but we do know that Sarah was inside the tent when the company arrived. Some people say that Abraham was watching the door just in case someone happened to be traveling by. They say that the custom of that time and place was to show hospitality to anybody that would be passing by. But most travelers, they're not going to be moving about during the heat of the day either. Now, verse 2 makes it seem as if these visitors just materialized rather than gradually approaching over the horizon when it said, "Behold, 3 men were standing opposite him." Kind of surprised Abraham, caught him off guard. But look at the response of Abraham here. He ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth. First of all, we see from the commentary on the prodigal son being greeted by his father that was running to him, running wasn't dignified behavior for an adult. Second, Abraham is 99 years old. If I saw a 99-year-old man run in the heat of the day and then fall on his face, I would be really concerned about his well-being. Third, notice how Abraham addressed one of them in verse 3. He said, "My Lord." First, there were 3 figures here, but Abraham used Lord in a singular form, addressing only one of the people in the group. Second, the actual word used for Lord in this text was Adonai. In the Hebrew Bible, Adonai is used to refer to God about 450 times, and it's often used in prayer, such as the Shema in Deuteronomy 6:4. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Ehad, which means, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," something that they would repeat every day. So from the Bible alone, we can begin to identify these 3 figures that appeared before Abraham. Now, the Church of England tries to make these 3 out to be the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But nobody can see the Father and live, so that cannot be the case. Using the Bible as a commentary on the Bible, we can take a sneak peek at the next chapter, which will tell us plainly the identity of 2 of these 3. Skipping ahead to Genesis 19, verse 1, it says, "Now the 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, as Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground." By the end of this chapter, these 2 depart from Abraham and make their way to Sodom, where we just read about them, while the Lord, Adonai, remains behind to talk with Abraham before he departs. So regardless of what some might say and guess about the identity of these 3, the Bible's actually pretty clear on that. We have the Lord and we have 2 angels. More than likely, it's a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ yet again. Before Bethlehem, Jesus would take on the form of a man, but at Bethlehem, he would become a man, God in human flesh. Here we see the hospitality and the kindness of Abraham. I'm almost certain that Abraham would have been just as hospitable if these visitors had been ordinary men, if it had been you and I. But I have a feeling that Abraham is fully aware of who has come to visit him. Keep in mind that the Lord has spoken to Abraham many times by this point and physically appeared a couple times as well. So there was probably some recognition going on there in Abraham's part. He literally begs them to stay and to rest in the shade while he brings them water, while he washes their feet, while he gets food for them. You know, there's 5-star service right in the middle of the desert. Hebrews 13:2 says, "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by this some have entertained angels without knowing it." We must also be hospitable and welcoming to those that are placed in our path. Yes, we still must be discerning, for there are some people out there who will abuse the charity of others. There are some people out there that will take advantage of you. But I like to think of when I give as if you're giving to the Lord, and those people will answer for their motives one day if they are untrue. So who knows? Maybe that man that looked homeless that you gave some money or food to, or that stranger that you gave a ride to, could have been an angel dispatched directly to you to test your hospitality. We just don't know. Or maybe they were in need of a sign that God loves them, and you were the one that the Lord sent in place of an angel to let the Lord use you and work through you in the life of those individuals. I read a story about an old man. He was telling them of an event that happened when he was really young. He said he was about 5 years old or so. He's outside playing in the sand, and he heard like metal clinking sounds. And he looked up and he saw a group of men wearing striped clothes. They're drenched in sweat, and they were all chained together. They were guarded by 3 armed men in uniforms. As an adult, he understands now that this was a prison chain gang being led out for work. He said that one of these guards approached the front door and asked his mom if they could drink some water from the water pump out in the yard. And she said yes, and then immediately called him to come inside the house in a hurry. He said his mother watched them through the windows, but she wasn't afraid. She wasn't concerned, but she felt pity on these prisoners. She began to make lemonade, and then she mixed up some tuna, some mayonnaise, and their last loaf of bread was used and cut up to make sandwiches. He remembers that that was supposed to be their dinner that night, and they didn't have much food back then. But his mom told him to help out, and he did. She carried the food outside while he carried the pitchers of lemonade. The prisoners began to stand up from their place where they were resting in the shade, and she told them to stay seated and let me serve you. And as the men cherished the lemonade and the food, one of them said to her, "Ma'am, I always wondered if I would ever see an angel. I believe that I have finally seen one today." That man finished his story with, "I don't remember what we ended up having for supper that night, but I remember having a feeling as if it was fed to me by an angel too." Let us go on into verses 6 through 8. So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, "Quickly, prepare 3 measures of fine flour, knead it, and make bread cakes." Abraham also ran to the herd and took a tender and choice calf and gave it to the servant, and he hurried to prepare it. He took curds and milk and the calf which he had prepared and placed it before them. He was then standing by them under the tree as they ate. We would be very blessed not to skip too quickly over these words here. Abraham was a very wealthy man. Just a few chapters ago, we read where he had 318 men that were able to go out into combat and rescue his nephew Lot. So he must have had hundreds more of other people with him as hired hands and servants. He could have just snapped his fingers and ordered everybody to get busy and serve their honored guest. But verse 6 shows him running again in the heat of the day at the age of 99. Do I need to remind you that this man has also just recently been circumcised? Walking would be painful, and here he is running. And we know that that circumcision must still be fresh, as less than 3 months have passed since the last chapter. In the last chapter, they were told that in 1 year, Sarah would be pregnant. By this point, she isn't yet, so that leaves 3 months for this promised conception to take place. So Abraham is running around by himself, not ordering servants to do everything. He tells Sarah to make some cakes and gets the help from a herdsman in catching a calf and in butchering it. But other than that servant, it's him and his wife serving these guests all by themselves. Now, I want us to look at the adjectives used to describe the things that they are doing. Verse 6, 3 measures of the finest flour. Not just any old ingredients that's on hand. Not stuff that's about to go bad, the best. Verse 7, a tender and choice calf. Not that old cow out in the corner that stopped giving milk and is about to die. The best calf he has. And verse 8, he took curds and milk. Curds and curdled milk is much like butter or cottage cheese or yogurt. Milk was highly esteemed in the ancient East because of its energy and it's easy to digest. Abraham gave his very best to the Lord. The real question is, do we give our best to the Lord? Do we give him the leftover change after paying bills, or do you immediately set some aside from the top? Do you give God just a little bit of spare time in prayer, or do you get up immediately and thank Him within the first few minutes of the day that He has blessed you with? And before we move on, I want to notice the speed and the urgency in Abraham when it comes to serving the Lord. He is a 99-year-old man running in the desert in the heat to meet the Lord. How big of a hurry are you in to meet the Lord in prayer when your alarm clock goes off? How eager are you to hear from the Lord in His Word? How excited are you to go to church and to worship Him? Are we going to let this man who is nearly a century old show us up? Let it not be so. Let's continue on into verses 9 through 15. When they said to him, "Where is Sarah your wife?" And he said, "There in the tent." He said, "I will surely return to you at this time next year, and behold, Sarah your wife will have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent door which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. Sarah was past childbearing. Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have become old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also?" And the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh, saying, Shall I indeed bear a child when I am so old? Is anything too difficult for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you, at this time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah denied it, however, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid, and he said, "No, but you did laugh." In verse 9, these people ask her, "Where is Sarah?" Notice the use of her new name. She had just gotten it, and now the Lord uses that name. The fact that Abraham didn't question how did they know his wife's new name shows that he really knew that this was from the Lord. But it wasn't as if they had no idea where she was. Just like when the Lord asked Adam where he was in the garden after he sinned. God knows everything. Whenever he asks a question, it isn't so that God can gain information. Rather, it's for our benefit in some way, shape, or form, depending on the circumstance. For Adam, the question of where he was hiding at, wasn't to identify his location, to drop a GPS pin. It was to draw out a confession and to put emphasis that sin had placed a gap between Adam and his God. For Sarah, the mention of her new name while she was within listening distance means that this promise concerns her as well. Maybe she remained in the tent while Abraham was outside with the guest as part of the custom of that day. Maybe when her new name was mentioned, she started listening and eavesdropping on this conversation of what's going outside. In fact, verse 10 even stated that Sarah was listening at the tent door, which was behind him. But the Lord wasn't upset about her eavesdropping or listening in. I think it's safe to assume that he was fully aware of her listening in, especially after her name was mentioned. Verse 12 says, Sarah laughed to herself. Now, laughing to yourself is a funny phrase, isn't it? I can imagine that maybe it first started with a smile or maybe a muffed giggle. Kind of like when you read a text, you might reply LOL, but you're not really laughing out loud most of the time, are you? You're probably just kind of huffing or snickering or smiling at your phone, something like that. That's what Sarah's doing. Maybe a little quiet giggle, but most of her laughter was inside. She was laughing not out of unbelief, not out of a lack in trust in God's ability to do this, but more like a laugh about how ridiculous this would seem if God wasn't a factor in this. Without God's intervention, there would be no way this would be possible. And here is this 89-year-old lady quietly giggling like a schoolgirl inside the tent, trying to grasp the idea that this is finally going to happen, what they have wanted their whole lives. Verse 11 stated the simple fact that she was past childbearing age. not to bring up feminine matters, but when she no longer cycled and when she had experienced menopause long ago, it was understood that this normally meant her baby making days were long over. She laughed to herself at this idea, and just as he knows every thought and action of every person, that laugh did not escape the Lord's notice. In verse 13, and the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? Shall I indeed bear a child when I am so old? Don't you know that Abraham's heart skipped a beat right there? Here he had just provided outstanding service for their guest, washed their feet, made them food, bowed before the Lord in recognition, and then he was asked, why is your wife laughing? Is anything too difficult for me to do? Rather than take away his promise because of her laughter, the Lord was faithful to reaffirm this promise and finally tell them the timeline. In verse 14, he promised to return at this same time next year, and Sarah would be holding the son that she would give birth to. And I believe her name was mentioned to avoid another incident like the one with Hagar. They are to wait upon the Lord and trust him. Now I want to acknowledge something else in this back and forth argument between Sarah and the Lord. In verse 15, Sarah denied it, however, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. And he said, no, but you did laugh. You know, Abraham had to really be nervous when his wife begins arguing with the creator of the universe. He was probably like, oh boy, honey, could you just please be quiet? Go back in the tent. Now, did Sarah lie to God in verse 15? She clearly stated that she did not laugh. Verse 12 did say that she laughed to herself. Maybe she was laughing on the inside and never made a noise outside. That's why she would be technically correct in saying that she didn't laugh. But the Lord knows the heart. He knows every thought. If she laughed in her heart, if she giggled in her mind, he knew it, and it counts as laughing. Centuries later, Jesus would teach that looking at a woman lustfully in your heart is adultery in your heart. Being angry with your brother in your heart is the same as committing murder in your heart. Folks, we can fool each other, but we can't fool God. We can say that we have great faith and that we don't doubt God, but he hears that scoff in your heart. He hears the laughter in your mind when you focus on the impossible task rather than focusing on God. When you are tempted to doubt, sometimes in your mind, just think of Peter trying to walk on the water. When Peter focused on the Lord, he was fine. When he focused on the storm, he was all wet and started to sink. Let us continue on into verses 16 through 22. Then the men rose up from there and looked down towards Sodom as Abraham was walking with them to send them off. The Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed? For I have chosen him, so that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him. And the Lord says, the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is indeed great, and their sin is exceedingly grave. I will go down now and see if they have done entirely according to its outcry which has come to me, and if not, I will know. Then the men turned away from there and went towards Sodom, while Abraham was still standing before the Lord. Judging from verse 16, these celestial visitors did not just stop in the desert for a snack. They're on business. First was the matter of reaffirming the promise that God had made to Abraham and Sarah. That might seem repetitive, but it's exactly what we all need. We need to constantly be reminded of God's promises to us over and over again. As the old hymn says, sing them over again to me, wonderful words of life. But there was more to this visit, and time was drawing near. They are walking towards Sodom, and Abraham was walking with them, at least part of the way, according to verse 16. In verses 17 through 19, the Lord asked a rhetorical question, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Well, the obvious answer was no, and this may have been the main reason for this visit to Abraham. In verse 20, the Lord said that the sin of Sodom had grown great, and there was an outcry pouring out to him. Who do you think was crying out from Sodom? Well, it could be the victims of the wicked men of that city, and I'm sure that number was large. Justice would be crying out. Creation itself would cry out as these unnatural abominations were occurring there. Perhaps even angels who had looked on had given reports. In verse 21, the Lord says, I will go down now and see if they've done entirely according to this outcry. God could know what's happening without literally walking down there because he is omniscient, he is omnipresent. And the same was true at the Tower of Babel. God didn't have to go down and discover the truth. He already knows. The point is that the Lord is not going to arbitrarily destroy the people of Sodom, but as a fair and just judge, he will examine the evidence firsthand and then judge according to their deeds. Although he is all-knowing, he still examines personally before making judgment. Really quickly, I want to look at this last verse again in 18:22. Then the men turned away from there and went towards Sodom, while Abraham was still standing there with the Lord. This is how we know that two of these men were really angels and one was the Lord. This verse shows those two headed towards Sodom, while the Lord stays behind. Chapter 19 clearly identifies those other two as angels in the opening verse when they get there. The fact that the two angels were going towards Sodom made it clear to Abraham that God's verdict has already been passed and judgment was now decreed. He knew that God's justice called for divine destruction. Let's go on into verses 23 through 25. Abraham came near and said, Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you indeed sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous and the wicked are treated alike. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly? One of the wisest sayings that I have heard this year was, when you don't understand something about God or what he is doing, rest on the things that you do know. And here Abraham was doing exactly that. Abraham came to faith at an old age when the Lord appeared to him. But over the years, Abraham has gained an understanding of the nature of God. And here he pleads for the people of Sodom based on the nature of God. And I think it's amazing that Abraham cares for them at all, knowing what all that they have done in that city. Abraham had earlier refused any rewards from the king of Sodom. He didn't want to owe them anything or have anything to do with their stuff. He could have just asked the Lord, hey, could you save Lot? And if you're, gracious enough, could you save Lot and his family? But Abraham pleaded for the entire city. Now, verse 23 presents a very difficult question. Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Sometimes that does happen. That's why Abraham had to go to war against those other kings. His nephew Lot had been kidnapped alongside those other people in Sodom. When we went through that chapter, I had said that Lot wasn't supposed to be there. His first mistake was in following Abraham instead of staying behind in Ur. His second mistake was pitching his tent towards Sodom. Thirdly, within a short time, Lot was living inside the city as a prominent member of the city. When Abraham rescued Lot, I had said before, that should have been a wake-up call for Lot. Maybe I need to go settle somewhere else. Quit hanging around these people, because when judgment falls upon them, I get swept away with it. He, even as his uncle made sure that he had no ties with that city or that king, Lot settled right back down there. If you keep the company of criminals, you shouldn't be surprised when you get arrested, when they get busted by law enforcement. You can plead your innocence when you reach the judge, but for the time being, you're going to go to jail just for associating with these criminals, whether you're innocent or not. And you're going to spend time there until things get sorted out and you prove your innocence. Wouldn't it be much better and much easier to simply keep better company to begin with? Psalm chapter 1 verse 1, the very first psalm. How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. Now I'm certain that many of the Israelites that were swept away by the Assyrians were not guilty of idolatry, and the same with the people of Judah who were exiled by Babylon. Daniel and his three friends, I mean, they were faithful servants of the Lord. I can't answer for the Lord in every situation when good people suffer at the hands of evil people, or because they happen to be within the vicinity of the wickedness and got caught up in it. As I said, I will rest in what I do know. And I do know that God is indeed faithful and just. He had a special plan for Daniel while he was in exile. He had a plan for Elijah. Even though Elijah feared for his life and ran, God cared for Noah and his family in the midst of the coming global judgment. But even if some people are undeserving and unaffiliated with their wicked surroundings, sometimes they do get swept away with the guilty as a result of the consequences of their sin. Before I ever doubt the justice of God, I would question my involvement with those that are being judged. Why didn't Lot move away earlier? Why am I hanging around with these people? And everybody always wants to ask this same age-old question. Why do bad things happen to good people? A better question would be, are there any good people? Are there any completely innocent people? We judge good by our standards, but God's standards are higher than ours. Matthew 5:48 says, therefore you are to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. That's a very tall order, and I'll confess to you, I can't do that. None of us can. That's an order that none of us can fill. And in Romans 3 it says, as it is written, there is none righteous, not even one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become useless. There is none who does good. There is not even one. To answer Abraham's question, yes, the Lord will judge rightly and fairly, and that should scare the daylights out of anyone who is placing their trust in themselves. If you're trusting in your own merit and your own righteousness, that should scare you that the Lord judges rightly. When people say only God can judge me, you want to say yes, and that should scare the daylight out of you. In his great mercy, though, God knew that none of us are innocent, and we are all deserving of his wrath for our disobedience. So he provided a way. His son, who is standing there listening to Abraham's concerns, knows that several centuries into the future, he is going to take on flesh, be born of a virgin, live a perfect life, and die a cruel death on a cross to pay for our sins. If only Abraham knew that at that time. Let us get the rest of these verses in verses 26 through 33. So the Lord said, if I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare the whole place on their account. And Abraham replied, now behold, I have ventured to speak to the Lord, although I am but dust and ashes. Suppose the 50 righteous are lacking 5. Will you destroy the whole city because of 5? He said, I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. He spoke to him yet again. Suppose 40 are found there. And he said, I will not do it on account of 40. Then he said, oh, may the Lord not be angry, and I shall speak. Suppose 30 are found there. And he said, I will not do it if I find 30 there. And he said, now behold, I have ventured to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there. And he says, I will not destroy it on the account of 20. Then he said, oh, may the Lord not be angry with me, and I shall speak only this once. Suppose 10 are found there. And he says, I will not destroy it on the account of the 10. As soon as he finished speaking to Abraham, the Lord departed, and Abraham returned to his place. In verse 26, Abraham pleaded, and he gave a hypothetical question. What if there are 50 righteous people? Did you notice that the Lord promised not to do so if there were 50 that were found righteous? You would expect him to say that he would spare the 50 that are righteous, but he says he will spare the righteous and the wicked. That is absolutely amazing grace. This conversation then shifts to what resembles the script of an episode of the TV show Pawn Stars. This negotiating there looks like Abraham's playing this numbers game, negotiating with the Lord. How about 45, 40, 30, 20, 10? Through each time, we can see the respect and the humility in Abraham as he pleads with the Lord, please don't be angry with me, but what if this? This reflects his humble attitude and his compassionate concern for the people of Sodom, not just Lot, not just his nephew and his family, but for everybody. After stopping at 10, he is assured that God would be willing to spare Sodom if only 10 righteous people could have been found in it. Now, surely Lot must have influenced some people while he was there, right? His wife and his daughters, that would make 4 people for sure. So that means there's 6 left. His daughters, we're going to see, were engaged, but the sons-in-laws only laughed at him when Lot said that they had to go, that judgment was about to sweep over the city. You would think that at least 6 people would have been transformed by Lot's life, by his testimony, but sadly, we're going to see that this was not the case. But before we judge Lot for his lack of saltiness and not letting his light shine, how many people do you think you're going to meet in heaven that are there because you either led them to the Lord or because you influenced them in some way to check out Christianity, because they heard your testimony or saw your lifestyle and decided to seek and to serve God because of you? Are there going to be at least 6 people there because of you? Abraham had bargained all the way down to 10 people, and the Lord agreed to that far. Abraham would not get the opportunity to go any further than that, because verse 33 says, as soon as he had finished speaking to Abraham, the Lord departed, and Abraham returned to his place. The Lord already knew what the angels would discover on their visit to Sodom, and that's what we'll cover in our next study in chapter 19.